I imagine that you've heard of the Oxford movement, but the question I want to look at today is partly who took all that high theology and actually walked it into the slums of London. This is the story of Charles Lowder. He's priest, pioneer, ritualist, and the man who turned incense and altars into tools for mission in the East End docks. My name is Matthew. This is Empire of the Sun YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to do a much deeper dive into a very short video that I put up on the channel a little while ago on Charles Lowder, just as a small introduction to introduce you to one of the heroes of the Anglo-Catholic faith. Today, we will look at, in much more detail, similar themes from that video. And this video really aims to explain the pivotal role of Charles Lowder in the emergence of slum priest ritualism. It will highlight that without that man, the likelihood of any other ritualist work in the slums of English cities would have been significantly diminished. Yet, despite the absence of substantial evidence of theological or political unity among these priests, their ability to work in harmony and minister together is a testament to the profound influence of Lowder's pioneering work. His impact on the Victorian slum priest ritualists is undeniable. He shaped the course of their missions and their ability to collaborate. Lowder was a pioneer of homeland parish-based mission work. His work is a testament to the unwavering Catholic faith that he held. It's inspired future Victorian slum priest ritualists to adapt the work to their own city's needs. He was primarily influenced by the belief that the lives of ordained priests in the Church of England should be marked by the Catholic faith and have a measure of holiness that he found lacking in those he worked with. Taking his influence from St. Vincent of Paul and John Henry Newman, he was a founding member and subsequent leader of the Society of the Holy Cross. His first mission, it could be said, was to the clergy in the church. And after that, he then provided an Anglican Catholic church for the poor in the London docks. This homeland mission was the first such mission in the Church of England, and from it, all subsequent slum priest ritualist missions were influenced. By the late 19th century, Lowder's influence had led to a small group of Church of England priests incorporating flamboyant ritualist practices into their church services. These practices, often viewed with skepticism by their contemporaries, were being introduced in some of the most impoverished areas of English cities, adding a unique and controversial element to the religious landscape in England of the time. While some praised the Victorian slum priest ritualists for their dedication and approach, they faced significant opposition. The contemporaries who opposed their Catholic style suggested that their style simply implied a theological allegiance with Roman Catholicism, or at the very least, it meant that they had sympathy with the perceived Romish Oxford movement. This opposition highlighted the distinctiveness of their practices and beliefs. There are two historians, Jeremy Morris and Nigel Yates, who have dominated 21st century assessments of 19th century high church Anglican ritualism. Both emphasize the commonality between all ritualists, choosing to dismiss any significant differences. Prominence has been given to practice rather than theological motivation for the broader ritualist movement and the slum priest ritualists specifically. Yates's quantitative approach contended that Victorian ritualism was primarily ceremonial, middle class, and rural, yet none of these fit into Lowder's slum-based ministry. This assessment is a modification of James Bentley's suggestion that ritualism may have been considered a frivolous activity, as he puts it, the Victorian leisure class. The Protestant Church Association, which has been paraphrased in Timothy Stratford's PhD, believed that ritualism was truly dangerous among the urban poor. but they were seemingly less concerned about these same practices of ritualism in the rural middle classes. This may explain why the slum priests often encountered more significant opposition than similar ministries in the affluent parishes. So Nigel Yates, who wrote this book, The Anglican Ritualism in Victorian Britain, 1830 to 1910, suggests that there are 6 ceremonial aspects of ritualism, making it distinct and more controversial in the 19th century, even compared to broader Anglican High Church, the broader Anglican High Church movement. These 6 aspects were this: the priest facing eastward during the Eucharist, the wearing of full Eucharistic vestments, the lighting of candles being present on the altar, the use of incense throughout the service, and the mixing of water with wine in the chalice, and the use of wafers or unleavened bread. Overall, the assessments are like this. If you put more simply, it means that academics and opponents believe ritualism as a movement to be an expression of Anglican Christianity, which resembled the Roman Catholic Church and Roman Catholic services more than that of their low church colleagues. All of these ceremonial aspects the slum priests had in common. Jeremy Morris then identifies the myth of the slum priest for the 19th century Anglican High Church revival as a problematic aside. This myth appears to have been popularized during the centenary celebrations of the Oxford movement in the 1930s. And during that time, commemorative hagiographical biographies uncritically described the work of the Victorian slum priest ritualists and aligned it with the Oxford movement in general. Influential academics have perpetuated this myth with little critical evaluation or thorough explanation of its origins. In addition, Morris argues that the perceived lack of quantitative impact appears to have discouraged any specific detailed assessment of these priests. However, later work has suggested that the influence is considerable compared to broader English ritualism. And that's sort of a numerical influence because of the need within the slums, the need of the people in the slums, whereas the middle class rural people were in much less need for help. So their inclusion in academic research over more recent times, these priests have chiefly been limited to brief mentions, as they seem little more than an interesting footnote in studies of Victorian Christianity, politics, and poverty. More recently, these priests have wholly been excluded from that research, which, to be honest, I find a little baffling. So, the visible birth of slum priest ritualism can be traced back to the 1850s with the experimental ministry of Lowder's lengthy mission to St. Peter's London docks. Yet the embryo was planted about a decade earlier in a small Somerset village when Lowder, who was a curate at the time, began thinking seriously about this. He was wondering how to gain the masses of the population to the church. His faith represented an expression of Anglo-Catholic theology that he had absorbed at Oxford University in the early 1840s, through the sermons and tracts of the first generation of the Oxford movement leaders. Notably, he was shaped by the preaching and writing of John Henry Newman. Lowder arrived in Oxford 11 months before the publication of Tract 90. That text argued that the 39 Articles could be interpreted in continuity with historic Catholic doctrine rather than demanding a Protestant interpretation of the 39 Articles. The Oxford movement wasn't an isolated religious revolution happening in the corner of the church. It was part of a much bigger 19th century story, where Anglicanism was already shifting under pressure from industrialization, rising poverty, biblical criticism, and the evangelical revival were also reshaping the church's mission and identity. At the same time, the broad church tradition was emerging, offering a more perhaps intellectually open and socially engaged and liberal Anglicanism shaped by reason, modern scholarship, and the confidence of the Victorian middle classes. The Oxford movement emerged inside the same moment of change. offering not a rejection of Anglicanism, but one of the possible ways it could respond. It sat aside and opposed to, in many ways, evangelical renewal, and it sat aside parliamentary reform and expanding mission work and broad church liberal theology, but it didn't replace them. In fact, it contributed another voice to the struggle over what Anglicanism should become. And in this wider Anglican conversation, that the Victorian slum priest ritualists tend to make more sense. Their work was not fringe or eccentric, but rather it was a lived street level expression of Tractarian theology. Where the Oxford movement debated church identities in universities, pulpits, and parliament, the slum priests carried these convictions into the most impoverished districts of Victorian England. This brings us to perhaps what Marvel might call the origin story of Charles Lowder. Lowder did not simply inherit the Oxford movement, he translated it. He transferred Tractarian theology into parish reality, into worship and discipline, sacramental practice and the pastoral presence amongst dock workers and labourers and families living in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. If the Oxford movement formed perhaps the theological question, Lowder provided one of the first practical answers. In 1882, 2 years after Lowder's death, his colleague Robert Linklater and book reviewer Charles Robinson suggested that Lowder's pioneering ministry impacted the slum dwellers of London Docks and the wider Church of England so much that they offered two suggestions. Firstly, that any writing of the religious history of England in the 19th century, that more than one paragraph should be devoted to the mission of Charles Lowder. Secondly, they said that ritualism had changed from its early manifestation to become more effeminate, but Lowder's ritualism and the continued Victorian slum priest ritualism was described as manly and glorious and only celebrated the magnificence of God. The significance of Lowder's mission alongside the broader slum priest movement has largely disappeared now from much of the Church of England's historiography. Yet he is among the select few Victorians who have a feast day in the Church of England. He is celebrated and commemorated on the 9th of September, just 5 days after Holy Cross Day. During his life, Lowder was a dominant influence on the subsequent slum priest ritualists, ministering in their congregations throughout the cities of England. He should also be considered an influence on broader Anglo-Catholicism and Anglican societies, which offer support and encouragement to like-minded English priests in the Church of England. Unarguably, from his ministry, all subsequent Church of England slum priest ritualists took their inspiration, adjusting their work to fit the demographic of a different city or area of London where their mission was based. Each priest's theological priorities and character created a separate mission similar enough to Lowder's to be categorized as Victorian slum priest ritualism, yet with enough theological differences to be considered independent. So that the development of slum priest ritualism is understandable, any considerations of these priests encompassing the chronological developments of theology and practice by necessity must start with Charles Lowder and his work in the slums of East London. Lowder's ministry had three sequential main phases. They were his belief that he had a calling to work as an overseas missionary, his adamance that holy living of the clergy was essential, and finally, he then created a fully functioning Anglo-Catholic parish church for the poor of East London. These phases dominated his thought and mission work. A combination of these developing convictions helped mold rather than abandon previous ideas and illuminate what Lowder thought he was doing and how he believed this to be the correct way to achieve his aims. Firstly, whilst a curate in Somerset and Gloucestershire, he felt a calling to be a missionary. Until the 1850s, missionary works in England were exclusively by parachurch ministries dominated by laity rather than clergy, and also dominated by interdenominational cooperation. Therefore, because of Lowder's devotion to the Church of England, he believed his call to mission required a move overseas. Still, this hope disappeared as mission organizations rejected him for this work. However, he never forgot that call to those starved of the gospel. He then added working as a chaplain in the workhouse in Axbridge to his duties of curate in the parish of Waltham-cum-Street. It is most likely that whilst ministering in the workhouse, the embryonic idea of a permanent homeland mission to the slum dwellers of England began. The publication of Lowder's discipleship pamphlet, The Penitent's Path, after his move to Tetbury, Gloucestershire, cemented his belief in the benefits of the high church methods among the poor, particularly his theology of the gospel, faith in the church, and confession to a priest. In fact, in the mission, which became the parish of St. Peter's, London Docks, he fulfilled his desire to reach those he believed knew nothing of the good news. And he presented that good news to them and finally provided a fully functioning conformist Anglo-Catholic church, which became home for its impoverished parishioners rather than the previous idea of this interdenominational parachurch organization. His ministering in the stronghold of high church practice in St. Barnabas, Pimlico during the early 1850s must have reinforced his belief in the Anglo-Catholic faith. His move to Pimlico perhaps could be interpreted as a provocative desire to learn to be an Anglo-Catholic priest. Following a 6-week suspension, he returned to work with a renewed insight from the life of St. Vincent of Paul, but believing that a lack of holiness amongst his fellow clergy was similar to the 16th century France and a critical issue that needed addressing immediately. He would be a founding member of the Society of the Holy Cross, the SSC, to promote holiness and accountability, and often communal living amongst unmarried High Church of England priests is the key to sustaining long-term mission work and reaching forgotten congregations with the gospel of Christ. While the SSC would attract only a relatively small amount of committed members, notable Oxford movement leaders were members or supported that society. To its theological opponents, the SSC was believed secretive, dangerous, and Romish by the Anglican Evangelical Catholic, the Anglican Evangelical Calvinists in particular. However, they published considerable resources advising priests on consistent methodology, most famously the benefits of confession. The publication of The Priest in Absolution, the first volume of which was available publicly, and the latter part, in order, as they said, to prevent scandal arising, was privately printed and distributed amongst their clergy. The accusation thrown at them was that the Romish practice of confession was an abomination, and that there was this alarmist belief amongst evangelicals that there was going to be a mass exodus from the Church of England to Rome, particularly during the 1890s. So the idea was that the priests would leave the Church of England and they would join the Roman Catholic Church. And in the 1890s, people thought this was imminent, but this fear never materialized. And as early as 1856, some SSC members publicly argued against the authority of the Pope. This mission to the church gained more traction once Mackonochie's more excellent organizational skills were engaged as he took over its leadership after the first 10 years. So Lowder also believed that it would only be after his missional call and the renewal of holiness that the Ritualist clergy could then successfully present the Anglican Catholic faith to the slum dwellers of those in St. George's in the East. This order was of utmost importance to Lowder, and this project, as it contextualizes Lowder's methods of his theological conviction, this third stage of Lowder's ministry was a primary element observed in action by the second generation of slum priest ritualists, including Robert Dolling, Arthur Stanton, and Robert Linklater. So what they had done is they had missed these other two stages of him wanting to be an overseas missionary and then his belief, thinking about high church methods. But what they see is they see his ministry in action. So they weren't present for the earliest priorities of Lowder's ministry, which means sort of evaluations have consistently suggested that the priest prioritized practice over theological motivation, which I think is probably a mistake. It's easy to see Lowder's influence on certain other slum priests. For example, he worked closely with Mackonochie, handing over the Society of the Holy Cross to his leadership. While Lowder could be described as an Anglo-Catholic ritualist, Mackonochie's influence was from Methodist revivalism. As such, Mackonochie may be labelled a Methodist ritualist. He began working as Lowder's curate in 1858 before becoming the first leader of the newly built bastion of Ritualism, St Albans, Holborn, which I think was 1862. Mackonochie's emphasis on conversionism, his emotional preaching style, and his understanding of holiness align him strongly with Methodism. And rather than abandon these ideas, Mackonochie incorporated them into his ritualist practice. In fact, he saw no contradiction at all between Wesleyan revivalism and ritualism. So he claimed that Wesleyan revivalism, that the slum priests themselves were the heirs of that, and that their expression of Christianity was the true legacy of the Wesleyan revival. Mackonochie can be considered perhaps a first-generation slum priest who learned from and developed Lowder's principles of church for the poor. Robert Linklater arrives at Lowder's mission near the end of Lowder's life. He works alongside him and then Mackonochie after his return to lead St Peter's London docks in the early 1880s. Linklater was an anti-papal ritualist, perhaps better labelled as an English ritualist. He believed in the church, but that church was the Church of England and not the Church of Rome. He published anti-papal literature that Protestant associations should have broadly supported. However, he tired of the life of a slum priest ritualist and removed himself from it quite cleverly by getting married and then working as a priest in a rural setting. As Mackonochie led St Albans, he used his organizational skills to their full potential. He appointed an eclectic team of curates from a theologically broad spectrum of Anglicanism. There was the Reverend E.F. Russell, who had broad church leanings, and there was Father Arthur Stanton, who was a firm evangelical preacher who worked for 50 years as a curate in St Albans. These three men worked together in the same church and supported the ministry of Lowder just a few miles away. This implies to me that something united them in mission, which had greater worth than their distinctive theological positions. Evangelical ritualist Father Stanton's preaching appealed to Scottish Free Church ministers who found them so significant that this one gentleman recorded them verbatim when he attended. Hodder and Staunton published 2 volumes of the sermon after Stanton's death, and then this Scottish ministers, Sir William Robertson Nichol and Russell, worked together to ensure their accuracy. So the publication of Stanton's sermons only exist because a Scottish Free Church minister attended the church and thought they were important. Robert Dolling, who took over the Winchester College mission in Lamport, Portsmouth, learnt his ritualism from those leading St Albans, Holborn. He had an evangelical heritage and argued that the Book of Common Prayer set the limits of ritual practice in the Church of England. Therefore, perhaps he could be called a prayer book ritualist, a term which other slum priests have often incorrectly been assigned. Dolling arrived in London as a non-Calvinist low church evangelical in the 1870s. And he was soon challenged by the methods used in St. Albans and St. Peter's to reach the poor. And rather than reject his legacy, he adds ritual practice to his already in-ground theology. This amalgamation of evangelical prayer book ritualism is likely why he was deemed suitable to lead St. Agatha's in Lamport, because the mission itself was funded by the Evangelical Winchester College. There are way more priests to discuss, but I think time doesn't really allow here. But briefly, let's mention the controversial Stuart Headlam, whose socialist political ritualism was supported by the leaders of St. Albans Holborn and Father Dolling, and led to a political, like the St. Albans was led by a political conservative and had liberal political leaning curates, and yet this socialist seems to come in and be able to work with them, and they can work together. So what I hope really to have shown in this maybe 25-ish or 30 minutes is that Victorian slum priest ritualism is much more complicated and more theologically diverse than has previously been suggested. And I wonder if Victorian slum priest ritualism is even the best term or definition for them. However, they are a definable group of people who have never been who never publicly criticized each other's ministries despite their differences. Maybe because of this, they're often incorrectly considered homogenous, but they definitely held differing beliefs. They definitely had unique personalities, and they even had distinctive methods. There are at least two generations of Victorian slum priest ritualists. Firstly, there's perhaps Lowder and Mackonochie, with Lowder the leading pioneer of ritual among the slums, and Mackonochie being the first to adapt Lowder's mission for the parish just a few miles away. The first generation of the Oxford movement directly influenced these slum priests. Each priest that followed brought their own eclectic theological beliefs, individual personality, and political leanings, and incorporated learnt ritualist practice to reach the most impoverished residents in English Victorian cities. And that for them was enough to unite them in mission with each other. If you've enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to the channel. There's plenty more to come. This has been a deeper dive into Father Charles Lowder.